Good afternoon. I'm Carol Busey, and I am the moderator of this session on David Zucchino's book, Wilmington's Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy. It is indeed an honor for us to have this book here at the Southern Festival, because David has won the Pulitzer Prize for 2021 for nonfiction for this book. It is a very important book, and I hope if you haven't read it, you will certainly be inspired to read it after our session today. David Zucchino is a contributing writer to the New York Times. His most recent articles have been about the war in Afghanistan, the withdrawal, and the overall condition of the country there. He did win a Pulitzer back in 1989 for his journalistic reporting of the apartheid in South Africa. He's been nominated for journalism 4 different times in addition to that. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our author, David Zucchino. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank everybody for coming in. I'm going to talk for maybe 10 or 15 minutes and just give you sort of an overview of the book and what it's about, and just sort of ground you. And then I think we're going to go to some questions from Carol, and then hopefully questions from you in the audience. So I'd like to begin today to talk about a violent event from 123 years ago that still reverberates in some of the racism, demagoguery, disinformation, and political violence that we see today. On November 10th, 1898, at least 1,500 heavily armed white supremacists in Wilmington, North Carolina, carried out the only armed overthrow of an elected government in American history. White vigilantes and white state militiamen killed at least 60 black men and drove more than 2,000 black citizens from the city 2 days after the 1898 midterm elections. At the time, Wilmington had one of the few multiracial governments in the South with black men in prominent positions. But the white mob evicted the city's 3 black and 7 white aldermen, the mayor, the police chief, and other elected leaders at gunpoint, and installed coup leaders in their place. They burned the city's black newspaper and tried to lynch the black publisher. They banished black leaders who survived the assault, as well as white, quote, race traitors who had served in city government with black men. Excuse me. These black and white leaders were marched at gunpoint to the Wilmington train station, thrown aboard departing trains, and told, "Don't come back or we'll kill you on sight." And not one of them ever dared return. Not one ever came back. The 1898 coup was a pivotal event, not just for North Carolina, but for the entire South. It cemented white supremacy as city and state policy for the next 60 years, and inspired whites across the South to use violence and terror to snuff out the black vote. It also turned a black majority city into a white supremacist citadel. Wilmington was 56% black in 1898. In fact, it had the highest black population among any major city in the South at the time. Today, Wilmington is less than 18% black. After the coup, black citizens in North Carolina did not vote in significant numbers for almost 70 years until after passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Now, in 1896, 2 years before the coup, there were 126,000 registered black voters in North Carolina, 126,000. By 1902, just 4 years after the coup, the number had been cut to 6,000. So you can see how effective this coup was in just destroying the ability for black men to vote. In 1898, there was just 1 black man in Congress in either the Senate or the House, George Henry White from a North Carolina district next to Wilmington. White supremacists hounded Congressman White and his family so viciously that he left North Carolina forever in 1900. White's parting words were, quote, "I cannot remain in North Carolina and be treated as a man." After the coup, no black citizens served in Congress from North Carolina until 1992. That's almost 100 years later. So that's for a century almost. This coup prevented or led the effort to prevent black citizens from serving in public office in Washington and from North Carolina. Wilmington's 3 black aldermen were forced from office at gunpoint in 1898. No black citizens served on Wilmington City Council until 1972, more than 70 years later. The coup also provided a blueprint for terror and intimidation of Black men who tried to vote elsewhere in the South. And it also ushered in the Jim Crow era in North Carolina. In fact, Wilmington was among the first cities in North Carolina to get Jim Crow laws when they segregated their streetcars. In 1906, white supremacists in Georgia plotted to steal the midterm election by attacking Black voters. But first, they consulted with Wilmington's coup leaders on how to do it. W. Hoke Smith, later elected governor in a stolen election, said, quote, "We can handle the Blacks the way they handled them in Wilmington, where the woods were black with their hanging carcasses," close quote. Now, most of you have probably never heard of the Wilmington coup until I read about centennial events in Wilmington in newspaper coverage in 1998. I hadn't either, and I went to high school and college in North Carolina. The coup was never mentioned by any professor or in any history book in all the classes I took. Now, many people who have read the book have the same two questions I had when I first learned of the coup in 1998. One, how could I not know about this? And two, how could this happen in the United States of America? I think the best answer I can give is this is a forgotten chapter of American history that was covered up or mischaracterized for a century, and it happened at a time when white supremacy went unchallenged. Now, victors indeed write history, so after 1898, white supremacist leaders in Wilmington wrote the narrative of their coup. They portrayed it as a, quote, good government initiative that replaced corrupt and incompetent Black leaders with honest white men. And they claimed it was Black men, not white supremacists, who were stockpiling weapons and planning a race riot. In fact, they called the coup a race riot, a Black-inspired riot, rather than a violent act of domestic terrorism by armed white supremacists. A century later, it was still being referred to as a, quote, race riot. But in fact, it was a racial massacre, a planned murder spree, and a white supremacist coup. That's why this book is titled Wilmington's Lie, for the lie that stood for decades. It's hard to believe now, but no one was ever held accountable. No one was ever arrested or charged for the murders or for the coup, and the federal government did absolutely nothing. Now, why was Wilmington such a threat to whites? First, it was a Black majority city at a time when almost all major Southern cities had white majorities. Second, Wilmington was an outlier. It was a bold experiment in multiracial government 30 years after the Civil War. Black men served in positions of authority. 10 of Wilmington's 26 police officers were Black men. The county treasurer, the county jailer, and the county coroner were Black men, and so were many magistrates. And they actually presided over cases involving white defendants. And there was also a thriving Black middle class of doctors, lawyers, and teachers. The federal customs collector at the Wilmington port was a Black man who earned more than the white governor. Now, this was intolerable to white supremacists. They vowed to overthrow, quote, Negro rule and, quote, Negro domination by the ballot or the bullet or both. They even had a name for their efforts. They proudly called it the White Supremacy Campaign. They issued a booklet for white voters explaining the tenets of white supremacy and Black inferiority. Here's one quote from the handbook that's quite clear about white intentions that summer. Quote, "This is a white man's country and white men must control and govern it." The booklet was called the Democratic Handbook. And you have to remember that in 1898, Democrats were the party of white supremacy and Republicans were the party of Lincoln and Black suffrage. And because the coup leaders announced their intentions well beforehand, this was a national story. And in fact, a lot of the research that I was able to do for this book came from newspaper stories, and particularly in the national press, as well as the North Carolina press. Now, national newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune, many, many others sent reporters, all white men, of course, to cover the, quote, race war in Wilmington. They were met at the train station by white supremacist leaders who arranged their lodging and gave them cigars and whiskey. The reporters were escorted around by white gunmen patrolling neighborhoods to guard against a purported Black riot. So their newspaper stories repeated the white narrative that Black men were planning to riot and kill white men and rape white women. And that's the story Northern readers got. And that's the lie that was told for decades afterwards. And just as a side note, I read hundreds of newspaper articles from 1898 and did not find a single instance where a white reporter interviewed a Black citizen, which I found just absolutely remarkable. Now, there have been many other so-called race riots in America, in Tulsa, Chicago, Atlanta, and elsewhere. But these were generally spontaneous outbursts of white rage, usually involving some sort of contact between a Black man and a white woman. But Wilmington was unique. The violence was premeditated. The coup was planned for months. It was a carefully orchestrated racial revolution carried out by armed vigilantes. And it was America's only permanent violent overthrow of an elected government. Now, you'd think this major event would be described in North Carolina history books. In fact, it was barely mentioned. And when it was mentioned, it was portrayed as a heroic white response to a Black race riot and a, quote, good government effort to replace corrupt, quote, Negro rule. In closing, let me just read you some descriptions of the coup that appeared in North Carolina public high school textbooks that helped keep the lie alive. Again, this is from state-sanctioned public textbooks for high school students. Here's a quote from a public school textbook, 1933, quote, there were many Negro office holders, some of whom were poorly fitted for their tasks. This naturally aroused ill feelings between the races, end quote. Here's a textbook passage from 1940. The mass of Negroes became poor citizens. To keep their vote, the carpetbaggers and scalawags allowed them to do very much as they pleased. The worst crimes were not punished. The white people of the South were no longer safe. And this is from a 1949 textbook. Quote, a number of Blacks were jailed for starting a riot and a new white administration took over Wilmington's government, end quote. And finally, this is from a 1940 textbook about the KKK, the Klan, and the red shirts who were the armed vigilantes in 1898 used by the white supremacists to intimidate Black people. Quote, to put an end to this terrible condition, white people joined together in a sort of club, which they named the Ku Klux Klan. Members dressed as ghosts and scared lawless men into acting decently. On moonlit nights, these men could be seen on horseback, riding to bring order back into the lives of their people. Such sights frightened Negroes into living better lives. The names of these men, Negro or white, who had done wrong were listed. The next moonlit night, the Klan would visit these men and punish them according to the wrongs they had done. After this, lawless men were not so bold and crime became less and less, end quote. On that note, I'll stop here and I'll answer a few questions from Carol and then I'll take questions from all of you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, David. It really is a wonderful introduction to what is a very powerful book. And it is really gripping to see what is going on. And one of the things that just amazed me so much about the book was some of your sources were these things that the perpetrators of this coup had very proudly written for the rest of the world to see and give them accolades for what they were doing to bring what they believed in their heads was good government.
Exactly. I thought that was one of the most remarkable things I came across when I was researching this book is just how many diaries, newspaper editorials and letters and memoirs were written by the perpetrators openly bragging about what they had done and really extolling the virtues of white supremacy and pointing out that this coup was so effective that it's basically eliminated the Black man, not only from voting, but from politics. And after that first generation died out, it was really interesting. Then suddenly all the information went quiet and people just stopped talking about it. And I think the next generation realized how painful that must be for their Black neighbors and how embarrassing it was for the world to know the truth of it. So it sort of was buried after that first generation died out and wasn't really talked about, except in certain occasions, like in the textbooks I mentioned, where it's mentioned in passing, but very much as a triumph of good government and good order.
And you know, it's, I guess, just a matter of human nature to some degree that the descendants of the perpetrators may be somewhat embarrassed, but they are not going to speak totally openly about what they know about what their grandfather or great-grandfather did. I was interested that you were able to even get interviews with some of those descendants.
Yeah, and it was very interesting. A couple were grandsons. One was Frank Daniels Jr., who's the grandson of Josephus Daniels, the editor of the News and Observer. And the News and Observer was really the driver of white supremacy during that summer of 1898, and ran a fake news campaign that incited white men to attack blacks. And I spoke with him. And in fact, my first job out of journalism school was at the News and Observer in Raleigh, and I worked for Mr. Daniels. And I worked there 5 years and had no idea Josephus Daniels had been involved in white supremacy. And they were busts and tributes to him around the newsroom, but they were all as, this crusading editor who was a wonderful person, never mentioned white supremacy. But in talking to his grandson and in talking to the grandson of another leader, George Roundtree of the right, they both said very interestingly that their grandfathers were men of their time, that they reflected the beliefs and the mores of the time. And during that period, it was accepted that black people were inferior to white people, and they were performing a sort of public service in bringing sort of the best people possible to government. They seemed to me that they sort of rationalized the roles of their grandfathers, even though at the same time they're saying, of course, it was wrong by today's standards, and nobody would do anything like that today. But you have to understand what the conditions and the environment was back in 1898.
And so after this story began to come out around the 100th anniversary of the coup, the state of North Carolina then had to appoint a special commission to really ferret out from all of the mythology about it, from both the African American population who had some family interest in the story, as well as these white descendants. How did that commission finally come to grips with all the information they were finding?
Well, it took them 5 years. It was a 5-year project. Their final report was very detailed. It was 460 some pages. And their main conclusion was, first of all, this was not a riot. This was a coup, that it did set black voting rights for decades, that it instilled white supremacy as state policy, all of that. And so they did correct the historical record. Finally, more than 100 years later, we finally get the truth. I don't think there were not that many people were really paying attention. There wasn't a whole lot of publicity, even in North Carolina, much less nationally. So I think it kind of slipped by, and people really didn't notice because people didn't know about the coup to begin with. So they tended not to read about an explanation for something that happened so long ago that they didn't know about in the first place.
That's right. Now we've got a question from Eric Hall here, and this is his question, with a little preface. Charles W. Chestnut's 1901 historical novel, The Mara of Tradition, uses the Wilmington massacre as the central conflict. Chestnut makes it clear that the white mobs are responsible for the massacre of Black Americans in his novel. Why do you think it took so long to reveal the true narrative?
And that's a great question. And in fact, that's a terrific book. And I used it as one of my sources. Even though it was fiction, it was very much fact-based. And it was useful for sort of getting the feel of Wilmington, the people, the environment. But as far as the story coming out, you have to remember this was a Black author, and white people back then didn't read Black authors. So it obviously enlightened the Black community, the Black people who read it, but they already knew the truth. So I think that's why it didn't have a whole lot of impact. And it wasn't until 100 years later that the real story starts to come out. But I would, if anybody's really, really interested in this period of history, it's worth reading that book to get, first of all, the African American perspective. And when we were talking about the state report a little while ago, the report made a big point of how difficult it was to get the Black perspective because so much of the narrative was told by whites. And you have to remember that Black citizens of Wilmington were in fear of their lives. They were running for their lives. They were leaving town. They had lost everything. So they were really in no position to write memoirs or diaries. They were running for their lives. And of course, the Black press didn't dare send Black reporters to cover this. But there were stories, and it was a great resource for me. The Black press in other cities where people from Wilmington fled, within days after the coup, got really real-time events and real-time interviews with survivors describing what had happened. So that was an excellent source of the Black point of view.
And, I hasten to add that the African American community, after reading your book, I realized how well educated it was. There was a strong group of teachers there.
Mm-hmm.
There also were doctors and lawyers who had been trained in all sorts of institutions around the country. And one of the central pieces of the book that I saw were these competing newspaper stories. And the spark, I suppose, for starting the decision that we've got to take over here from the white supremacists there was an editorial in the African American paper, The Record, the Daily Record, by Manley, the editor of it. Alex Manley had written something that really provoked the whites of Wilmington. Can you?
Yes, Alex Manley was actually the grandson of a white governor, but he lived his life as a Black man, and he was a very aggressive journalist and he started a daily Black readership newspaper in Wilmington. And in August of 1898, he read a speech from the wife of a white congressman in Georgia, in which she said the solution for a so-called rape epidemic of white women by Black men, which there was no epidemic, but she said there was, and that the solution, she said, was, quote, the lynch rope. And she said, quote, I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. And she was telling the men of Georgia they needed to go out and start lynching Black men to stop this rape epidemic. Alex Manley was incensed when he heard about this, and he sat down the day he found out about it in August and wrote a very incendiary editorial that just absolutely shocked the white supremacists and whites across the South. It was reprinted across the South. And essentially he said that most Black men who were lynched for supposedly raping white women were in fact their consensual lovers. And secondly, he pointed out what everyone knew, but he put it in writing, that white men had been raping Black women for generations with impunity. And this absolutely incensed the white community. And in fact, the vigilantes, who were the red shirts, wanted to lynch him that day. But just to show you how premeditated the coup was, the coup leader said, no, this is too early. This will have a much better political impact if we wait till closer till the election in November. And then they said, then you can lynch Manley and then you can burn down his newspaper. And they did burn down his newspaper, but he was warned a couple of days beforehand that a lynch mob was looking for him. He fled and escaped and never went back.
And Rebecca Felton is the woman that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And, she really was, she was on one level a feminist, a suffragist, and then on the other hand, she was a white supremacist. And you do see that the woman suffrage movement was inextricably tied with white mm-hmm. supremacy. And both sides, both the anti-suffragists and the people who supported women having the right to vote, played the race card quite loudly as they were trying to get their views known across the country, but particularly across the South. And there's some version of a lot of this business about lynching in probably every state of the 15 where state slavery was legal at the time of the Civil War. Not all of those 15 left the Union, but there was this tremendous fear. And if you can spread fear, you can capture the attention of almost anybody. And it was every African-American male is a potential rapist. We have to protect our Southern women. Yeah. And one of the things that gave me a little bit of a chuckle in this book was when the legislature of North Carolina is discussing miscegenation laws, and the comment was made that they better not go too far into this one because most of the white members of the legislature are probably guilty
Exactly.
one way or another. And that did give me just a small chuckle that they were going after themselves in all of this about the book.
Right. Yeah. It was a white judge who made that comment, and it shut down all attempts to pass that law. They just quit after that. But the term they used in the newspapers to incite whites was the black beast rapist. And they planted, particularly the News Observer, all these phony stories about black men supposedly preying on white women that were completely false. But the narrative was that you better get your gun and go out and lynch black men because they are coming for your women, and they're going to rape women. And that was a really strong component of the whole white supremacy campaign. The other component was that black men were not capable enough or intelligent enough to vote, and they certainly weren't competent enough to serve in public office. And that message was just drummed home to the white readership of the newspapers. And you have to remember, at this time, the newspaper was the source of information. That was the entire news media, but they were very, very effective at disinformation and fake news.
Yes. And, they did get their point through to the people. One of the things that you mentioned were the guns, and these people are stockpiling weapons. And we've seen some stockpiling taking place in more recent times as well. But people were stockpiling, and the kinds of weapons the white supremacists had amassed during the planning of this was just astonishing to me. And I can only imagine the terror that some of these African Americans felt when they see all of this, because they're already afraid of these folks. And so one of the most painful parts of the book to me was the African American families who just felt like they had to get out of their houses that day because they were going to be burned out or killed. And they went into the swamps and into the cemetery on a November night when it's cold and wet. And they hid laying down in this wet cemetery for a couple of days. Two women, didn't two women give birth and die in the cemetery, and the children died. And then when they finally get brave enough to get back, I mean, the children are wet, the children are crying. It was such a descriptive scene that I could visualize what it was like for those people, afraid to go back, but knowing they were all going to die out there in that cemetery.
I mean, they left their homes with no warning at all. They knew something was coming, but then when they see 60 black men just murdered in the streets, they're all fleeing for their lives. And you mentioned the guns. There were several newspaper correspondents that said Wilmington was probably the best armed city in America at that time. I mean, they had Winchester rifles and pistols. In fact, the gun stores ran out of weapons and ammunition, and they had to telegraph Richmond and Baltimore to load these weapons and ammunition on trains and send them down to Wilmington. At the same time, all the gun dealers, of course, were white, and they refused to sell to black men. So the black community had very few weapons, and the other very, very effective tactic that the white supremacists used was to make sure there were two white militias who were basically the National Guard of the day, the Wilmington Light Infantry and the Naval Reserves. These were state militias, supposedly reporting to the governor, but in fact, they were commanded by white supremacists, made up of white supremacists, and basically took orders from the white supremacist leaders of this campaign. And this summer of 1898 was the summer of the Spanish-American War. The white militias and the two black militias, two black companies, were called up to the war. The white supremacist leaders made sure the white units were back in Wilmington in time for the coup, and they were. They also made sure the two black units were in Georgia on a training base and did not get back, because that was the only armed, young, trained men, black men in the city, were out of the city, and they made sure they didn't come back in. And they unleashed the two militias on the black population. And actually, during the summer, the two militias were equipped with what they called rapid fire guns, were the first machine guns that they put on on the back of a wagon pulled by horses, and they were paid for by white supremacist merchants to make sure they had enough firepower to put down this purported black riot.
Now, you mentioned the Spanish-American War, and the African Americans had, even before November 10th, made pleas to President William McKinley, and McKinley was the son of abolitionists. And tell us about President McKinley's reluctance to get involved, his response, as well as the response of other national leaders.
Yeah, as you mentioned, McKinley was the son of abolitionists. He was an abolitionist himself. He served in the Union Army as an officer, was very much against slavery and against segregation. In fact, when he was running as a candidate for president, was the first presidential candidate to address an all-black audience on the campaign trail. So it's baffling to me that his response was minimal. As you mentioned, he was warned by George Henry White, the congressman, and by black ministers from Wilmington who traveled to Washington, met with him in the White House and warned him, Mr. President, there's a coup being planned. They're already, white people are beating and intimidating and terrorizing black men, and they're planning a coup. He did nothing. After the coup, Congressman White and these same ministers went back and met with him again and asked him to send federal troops to protect the voting rights of black men. He made no comment ever that I could find publicly about the coup. It was discussed in one cabinet meeting, and the topic of sending federal troops or federal marshals to North Carolina was brought up, but nothing ever happened. So no one, as I mentioned earlier, was ever held accountable. There was a grand jury set up, but white witnesses refused to cooperate. So no one was indicted, no one was certainly arrested, and no one was ever jailed or convicted. They completely got away with it.
You know, it's really interesting to me that McKinley, as a Republican politician, would have really cared much about the South, because the Republicans in those days were not carrying any Southern states anyway. North Carolina and Tennessee and some of the border states had populations of Republicans in the mountains, more or less, the western part of North Carolina, the eastern part of Tennessee. And yet so I can't understand why President McKinley couldn't take a strong position about this, because it surely wasn't because he was afraid he was going to lose the South in the 1900 election. Yeah,
that perplexed me too. As you say, he was running for re-election, but I think he made a calculation with this coup, and he figured that it would spread, that there would be no black vote. He realized that, and blacks had helped put him in office. The black vote was very important to him in getting elected. But I think he realized now, because of this voter intimidation and the white supremacy movement across the South, there weren't going to be any black voters, and he didn't want to antagonize the white leadership, which he needed, which he was going to need them in Congress, not necessarily to get elected, because as you mentioned, Republicans definitely didn't carry the South anyway. But I think he made a calculation that he needed them. So I think for whatever reason, he just kept quiet. I could find nowhere in his memoirs or any public records that he ever made a public comment about Wilmington. And he had a lot on his mind because there was the peace talks after the Spanish-American War, and there was a lot of political pressure on other fronts. So I don't think this was a big issue for him.
No, I don't think it was a big issue. And, you know, the whole subject of voting rights was integral to all of this whole racial tensions that's coming up with Jim Crow politics and whatnot across the South. What was interesting to me to learn in your book was the extent of the communication between these white supremacists in North Carolina with white supremacists in Louisiana, for example. You know, the idea that they came up with these grandfather clauses and other ways to prevent African-American voting. Can you say a little bit about the grandfather clauses and some of the other tactics that they were swapping ideas about?
Exactly. And it was done largely through the newspaper coverage. But you mentioned the grandfather clause. It had been used in Louisiana. And Josephus Daniels, as editor of the News and Observer, was actually not a journalist. He was a politician who owned a newspaper. He actually was on the executive committee of the Democratic Party and held Democratic Party leader meetings in his newsroom. And the white supremacists realized they had a problem, first of all, with poll taxes. There were a lot of poor whites who couldn't afford the poll taxes, so they would be harmed by poll taxes. And then the literacy tests, almost 25% of the white electorate, or of whites in North Carolina at that time, were illiterate. So they had to get around that problem. And what they did was copy, to a certain extent, Louisiana's grandfather clause. In North Carolina, it said that if your ancestor voted before 1868, then you were eligible to vote. And 1868 was a pivotal year because that's the year black men got the vote. Of course, no black men would have an ancestor who voted them because black men didn't vote. So it completely disqualified all black voters, except maybe those who their grandfather was white to some extent, but that was a minority. So it basically eliminated black men from voting, but gave an out to poor whites and illiterate whites. It was a very effective piece of legislation. It passed in 1900, and that played a big role in black citizens not voting for more than 70 years in North Carolina and elsewhere in the South as well.
Well, it definitely suppressed the vote all across the South, I think, too. You're right about that. And, you know, one thing that as this riot, sort of this momentum gets started, one thing that I shouldn't have been surprised of was that just groups of men started coming to Wilmington. You know, they wanted to get in on the fight. It was almost like they wanted to get in on the action there. And that was very surprising to me.
Yeah, the real shocking thing was that Governor Daniel Russell was a Republican. He was from Wilmington. He was part of his grandfather had been a slave owner. He grew up on a plantation, but he was a moderate by the standards of the time, and absolutely owed the black voters for putting him in office. And yet he gave the order that day, the day of the coup, for the two white supremacist militia to go out into the streets and starting, quote, putting down the riot. And that was a pivotal moment. And I think he was completely intimidated by the white supremacists. He was related to a lot of them by blood or marriage. They knew him. They threatened his life. He carried a pistol with him, and they threatened to impeach him. So I think he was so intimidated, he did whatever they wanted. But he stood by and did absolutely nothing as black citizens were murdered in the streets, indirectly on his orders that freed the two militias to begin attacking men to put down this purported black riot.
And North Carolina had the Republicans and the Democrats, but they also had this other kind of more fluid group, the Fusionists. Tell us a little bit about the Fusionists. Yeah,
that was actually, the Fusionists is what allowed, I guess you could call them the progressives of the day, to take over the Wilmington city government in an election in 1897. The People's Party, which was mainly poor white farmers, had become disenchanted with the Democratic leadership. They had voted Democratic, but they felt they were being ignored by the bankers, the railroads, and the lawyers. And these were poor white farmers who had more basic issues like education for their children, crop prices, support for farmers. So they through their allegiance to the Republican Party, which meant that they were aligned with black voters, because almost all blacks at that time, black men, voted with the Republican Party. And so this was called fusion. It's with the white farmers and then the white and black Republicans. And it was strong enough to take the state legislature, I think in 1896, and in 1897, in a disputed election, they took power in Wilmington. And it was the very presence of black men in office that enraged the white supremacists so much that they planned the coup.
And you know, it was very interesting to me that from my perspective, the main leader of the coup was Alfred Waldell, and yet somewhere in the middle of the coup, he says no lynching, and you know, they were looking for Alex Manly. They had checkpoints all around the city, and then he says no lynching. And the most silly thing, I suppose, one of the many silly things, is he almost crowns himself mayor after they get the Fusionist mayor out of office. And so all of the government officials, even the white ones, which were the majority of the government officials, all got sent home. And Waddell has control of the whole city.
Yeah, and that's why he was put in this awkward position all summer. I mean, his role during the summer was to give these incendiary speeches, really inciting white men to attack black men and terrorize them and keep them from voting. And in fact, the night before the election, he told them to, if they went out and saw a black man trying to vote, they should order him to go home. If he didn't, shoot him down, shoot him in his tracks. That was his direct quote. But once and in fact, after at gunpoint, they removed the previous city council, the mayor, and the police chief, they held a, quote, election. It was a fake election, and he was, quote, elected as mayor. So here you have the leader of a coup named as mayor, and then he was put in the position of having to now provide public security and protect citizens, black and white. So he started giving these speeches saying, okay, everybody go home and put down your guns. But this violence that he had incited had gotten out of control by then. So then he finds himself in this awkward position of saying, well, you know what? Lynching's not such a great idea now that I'm in charge. And we have to protect everyone. So everybody go home. And he was completely ignored, of course.
And so they control the narrative of how this story is going to be told. We were saving Wilmington. We were saving North Carolina. We were saving the South. And
white women,
yeah, white women especially. And, one of the things that you said in the book, and I will have to paraphrase it, but it was something that even though the slavery had ended with the Civil War and white people understood that slavery did not exist, that black people were still black. Mm-hmm. And that was what made all the difference to these folks. And it was so totally racially motivated. And so, I am a little bit curious to find out a little more about what happened in Wilmington after World War I, when we have the riot in Tulsa and the rejuvenation of the Klan at Stone Mountain, Georgia, and the 1925 Klan convention in Washington, where they proudly marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. So I'm very interested in learning a little bit more about that, because this was only one of these massacres that took place. And there were lots of these kinds of things across the South. So tell us here in the 2 minutes we've got left, what do you hope your readers will take away from this book?
Well, one thing, one big reason I wrote this book was to correct the historical record and tell the true story of what really happened. And I hope what people take from this book is that the danger and the power of demagogues, of disinformation, of using violence for political ends is dangerous. It's a real deep and embedded part of our history, as is institutionalized racism, and learn to recognize the signals that tell you that this is happening again. And I see it a lot today, particularly when Trump was president, the demagogue, the misinformation. I see this being repeated. So I hope the lesson from this book is to be alert, to be aware. Democracy is very fragile. And once you start inciting people to violence for whatever reasons, it's hard to stop it, as Colonel Waldell found out. And I see us in that position today, particularly with the January 6th insurrection, which was very similar to what happened in 1898, where people essentially equated patriotism with vigilantism. They were told that their way of life and their very country was being taken from them. And in both 1898 and on January 6th, people responded with violence in protecting what they thought was their way of life.
And certainly the price of democracy is that we have to be vigilant. Mm-hmm. We live in this wonderful place and we have to be vigilant, and voting is power. And we need to make sure that the franchise is there for people to be able to use that power that they have to have a say in government. And so I want to say thank you to you, David, for writing this book. I want to say thank you to all our viewers for participating and watching this session, and encourage you to get this book from your local public library or purchase the book and read it. It is a very important book that I think every American needs to read to understand many of the things that are taking place from time to time across the country, and actually, indeed, across the world. And so I want to close with a quote from James Loewen, who passed away a few weeks ago. And this is what he said about American history and how American history is taught, which of course is a debate across the country right now, what should be taught and what should be omitted from the teaching of American history. And this is what he said: the antidote to feel good history is not feel bad history, but honest and inclusive history. And he goes on there in that passage of one of his books that honest history teaches that the good and bad come together, and that is part of our collective identity. And we have to kind of pay attention to our collective identity so that we can help our country grow more thoughtful, more tolerant, rather than being an ethnocentric nation. And I do think what is included in the history books is very important to all of us today. So I hope you will enjoy coming to grips with this story, learning about it, and then learning about the history of your community or your state that perhaps is not as well known either. Thank you very much for coming today. I hope we will see you again next year.
Thank you, Carol. Thanks, everybody.